In the early weeks of 1947, Rudolf Höss sat in Polish custody and wrote. He had commanded Auschwitz through its years of greatest killing capacity. He had not observed the system from a remove. He had constructed much of it. The autobiography he produced awaiting execution is lengthy, precise in places, and disarming in its apparent candor. Polish examining magistrates had asked for it. He complied without apparent reluctance. This is not the story of how that candor was extracted. It is the story of what candor, in a document like this, actually means, and where, precisely, it ends. In a Polish prison cell in the early weeks of 1947, a man sat writing by hand. He was 46 years old, in the custody of the Supreme National Tribunal of Poland, and he had perhaps 3 months left to live. The document he produced in those weeks, a longhand autobiography written in German, at the request of Polish examining magistrates, would become one of the most cited and most debated primary sources in the historiography of the Holocaust. It is unusually complete. It is unusually candid. And it is, in ways that took historians decades to fully articulate, unusually difficult to read as a moral document. This script is not about the crimes committed at Auschwitz-Birkenau. It is about the nature of what Rudolf Höss chose to say, and how he chose to say it, when he believed that speaking fully was the only remaining act of consequence available to him. Rudolf Höss was born in November of 1899 in Baden-Baden, the son of a devout Catholic merchant who intended him for the priesthood. That trajectory ended when the First World War began. Höss enlisted at 14, served through the full duration of the conflict, and was among the youngest non-commissioned officers in the German army to receive the Iron Cross First Class. He was not, by the biographical record, a particularly ideological figure in those early years. He was a soldier who had learned, early and thoroughly, that institutional belonging and personal effectiveness inside a hierarchy were the conditions under which he felt most capable of functioning. The war gave him that structure. Its end removed it. The post-war years produced in Höss what they produced in many men of his cohort, a movement toward paramilitary organization as a substitute for the institutional clarity that demobilization had dissolved. He joined the Freikorps in the early 1920s, participating in the irregular violence of the Baltic Campaign and later in the interior political turmoil that characterized Weimar Germany's most unstable period. In 1923, he was convicted of murder in connection with the killing of a man suspected of informing on nationalist activists. He served 5 years of a 10-year sentence before a general amnesty returned him to civilian life. He was not yet 30 years old, and he had already established, for those tracking his record, a pattern worth noting: a capacity for violence within sanctioned institutional contexts, combined with a consistent personal posture of compliance with whatever organizational authority he recognized as legitimate. His path into the SS came through agriculture, not ideology. In the early 1930s, Höss joined a settlement organization associated with Heinrich Himmler's vision of SS land stewardship, working on farms in northern Germany. Himmler personally encouraged him to enter the active SS. By 1934, Höss had been assigned to Dachau, where he would spend the next 3 years under the direct supervision of Theodor Eicke. This assignment is, in retrospect, the most consequential institutional apprenticeship in his biography. Eicke was systematizing the concentration camp model, developing the guard regulations, the disciplinary codes, the administrative procedures that would be exported to every camp that followed. Höss absorbed that system at Dachau, not as an ideologue absorbing doctrine, but as an administrator absorbing method. He learned how a camp was run. He learned what it required of its personnel. He learned, specifically, that the most effective camp administrators were those who could execute policy without importing personal feeling into the execution. He was transferred to Sachsenhausen in 1938, where he continued in administrative roles, And then, in the spring of 1940, he received the appointment that would define everything that followed. Höss was named commandant of a new installation near the Polish town of Auschwitz, a site selected for its rail access and its relative isolation. The camp was to be called Auschwitz. He was 40 years old. He had not sought the appointment through ideological demonstration. According to the administrative record and his own later account, he was selected because his superiors considered him thorough, reliable, capable of building operational infrastructure from limited resources without requiring sustained ideological motivation from above. He was, in the institutional vocabulary of the SS, a dependable manager. This matters because the standard frame applied to perpetrators of the scale that Höss represents, the frame that reaches for fanaticism, for pathological hatred, for some exceptional moral deformity, does not, on close examination, fit the biographical record. What the record shows is something more difficult to process. A man of ordinary institutional appetites, shaped by a specific sequence of organizational experiences, who arrived at the center of industrial mass murder through a pathway that rewarded competence and reliability rather than extremism. That distinction is not exculpatory. It is explanatory, and the difference between those two functions is one that the historical record demands be maintained with precision. What Höss brought to Auschwitz was not hatred as a driving operational force. He brought administrative experience, a demonstrated tolerance for the conditions of incarceration work, and a capacity to manage logistics at a scale that most of his contemporaries found overwhelming. Under his commandancy, the camp expanded from a converted Polish army barracks holding several thousand prisoners into a complex of facilities that at its peak held over 90,000 people and, through its Birkenau subconstruction, processed arrivals from across occupied Europe. He oversaw the architectural decisions, the staffing structures, the supply chains, and, beginning in 1941, the implementation of the killing operations that transformed Auschwitz from a concentration camp into the largest single site of mass murder in human history. He was not adjacent to these events. He was not a witness to them in the sense that the word witness implies an observer standing at some remove from the action. He designed the operational architecture. He made or ratified the decisions. He was, in the precise meaning of the term, the responsible authority. This proximity inversion is the first and most fundamental point the confession documents require the reader to hold in mind. When Höss wrote about Auschwitz in Polish custody, when he described the selections, the gas chambers, the crematoria, the capacity constraints, the personnel difficulties, he was not a bystander reconstructing what he had seen from a position of partial knowledge. He was an architect describing his own construction. His account carries the authority and the limitation of that position simultaneously. He knew the operational record in detail because he had produced it. What he could not necessarily provide, and what the autobiography would reveal, in its texture rather than its admissions, to be almost entirely absent, was any account of what that position had cost him at the level of experience. The Nuremberg proceedings of 1945 and 46 constituted the first formal layer of the testimonial record. Höss was captured by British military police in March of 1946, working under a false identity on a farm in Schleswig-Holstein. He had been living quietly for several months after the war's end, hidden by family connection. The capture itself was not gentle. British officers used physical coercion during the initial interrogation, a fact that historians, including Nicholas Waxman, have flagged as relevant to how the earliest statements should be read. Within days of his arrest, Höss was transported to Nuremberg, where he gave a sworn affidavit that would be entered into the record of the International Military Tribunal. That document, brief, numerical, delivered under pressure, and in unfamiliar institutional surroundings, was not the autobiography. It was the first statement, and understanding what came after requires understanding what it was: compressed, pressured, and not yet the account of a man with time to decide how he wanted to be understood. The Nuremberg affidavit was not the autobiography. That distinction, apparently technical, carries considerable weight for how the full record must be read. The affidavit was produced under conditions of acute institutional pressure. Höss had been in British custody for a matter of days, had undergone physical coercion during initial interrogation, and was being processed through a legal apparatus whose primary purpose was not to understand him, but to document the system he had served. The affidavit gave the tribunal what it needed: numbers, dates, named facilities, an explicit acknowledgement of his role. What it could not give, and was not designed to elicit, was the account of a man with time and relative stability in which to decide how he wanted to be understood by the historical record. That account came later, in a different city, under different conditions, written in his own hand. Polish authorities received Höss in May of 1946, and it was in Krakow, in the custody of the Supreme National Tribunal, that the document historians now call the autobiography took shape. He wrote it in German, in longhand, between late 1946 and the early weeks of 1947, at the explicit request of Polish examining magistrates who wanted a comprehensive account of his life and the operational history of the camp he had commanded. He was not writing voluntarily in the sense of writing without constraint. He was a prisoner awaiting a capital sentence, and the Polish prosecutors had both legal authority over him and practical means of making his remaining months more or less bearable. But he was writing with time. He was writing with enough physical distance from the moment of capture that the text reads, in its structure and pacing, as something more deliberate than a deposition extracted under duress. The autobiography covers an unusual range of material. Höss writes about his childhood in Baden-Baden, his relationship with his father, his religious formation, and the disillusionment that followed the First World War. He writes about his years in the Freikorps, his early SS assignments, his family life at Auschwitz, where his wife and children lived within the camp complex, in a house whose garden bordered the perimeter, and the operational history of the installation itself. What is structurally notable, and what historians including Nikolaus Wachsmann have flagged in their analyses of the document, is the emotional register in which all of these subjects are treated. The childhood and the gas chamber capacity figures occupy roughly equivalent emotional territory in the text. Neither is dramatically elevated. Neither receives a prose register that distinguishes it as categorically different from the other. The autobiography moves through these subjects with a kind of bureaucratic evenness that is itself, on close examination, a significant finding. The specific passages in which Höss describes the arrival and selection process at Birkenau are the clearest illustration of this tendency. According to his own account, transports arrived on the rail spur that had been extended into the camp in 1944, and the selection, the process by which arriving prisoners were divided between those sent immediately to the gas chambers and those assigned to the labor pool, was conducted by SS physicians on the ramp. Höss describes this process in terms of its logistical components: the arrangement of the arriving columns, the role of the physicians, the movement of those selected toward the undressing rooms, the capacity of the crematoria relative to the volume of arrivals during the Hungarian deportations of that same year. The language is the language of throughput and facility management. It is not the language of human beings arriving, in the overwhelming majority of cases, at the last hours of their lives. This is the first named gap in the confession documents, and it requires careful framing. What Höss does not describe in any sustained or individualized way is the experience of those processed through the installation he commanded. The arrivals appear in his text as numerical variables, categories defined by origin, transport number, and assignment status, rather than as persons whose individual presence he registered or whose fates he understood in terms other than operational outcome. The autobiography contains, across its full length, fewer than handful of passages in which a victim is described in terms that would allow a reader to understand them as a specific human being with a specific presence in the physical space Höss occupied. This absence is not a minor textual feature. It is structural. The temptation, when encountering this gap, is to read it as evasion, as a deliberate strategy by which Höss protected himself, in his own account, from the full moral weight of what he administered. That reading is understandable, but it is probably too simple, and the simplification matters. Evasion, in the conventional sense, implies a gap between what the person knows and what they choose to disclose, a withholding of recognition that is, underneath, present. What the Höss autobiography more consistently suggests is something different, a mode of perception in which the operational framework was not merely the language he chose to use, but the actual structure through which he processed what he saw. He does not deny the killing. He does not minimize the scale. He volunteers figures and operational details that in many cases went beyond what his interrogators specifically requested. The depersonalization in the text does not appear to be defensive in its architecture. It appears to be constitutive, embedded in the way he organized experience rather than applied as a filter over a recognition that existed beneath it. That distinction is significant not because it exonerates him, it does not, but because it changes what the document can be used to demonstrate. If the autobiography were a strategic concealment, it would be evidence primarily of a man managing his self-presentation. If it is instead a relatively accurate account of how Höss actually organized his experience of Auschwitz, it becomes evidence of something considerably more difficult, the way in which an institutional framework of sufficient coherence and administrative density can structure a person's perception of events so thoroughly that the moral register simply does not assert itself as a competing mode of understanding. The reliability question, introduced by this reading of the text, cannot be resolved at this stage of the analysis. What it can be is named precisely. The question is not whether Höss was telling the truth in a factual sense. The operational details he provided have been extensively cross-referenced against other documentary evidence and found, in their broad outlines, to be accurate. The question is, what kind of truth-telling a document can accomplish when the person producing it appears to lack access, in any robust sense, to the interior dimension of the events they are describing. A man can accurately report the logistics of a killing operation and still produce a document that is, in the most important sense, incomplete. Höss did both of these things simultaneously. Recognizing that they are not contradictory is the condition for reading what he left behind with anything approaching adequate precision. The difference between the Nuremberg affidavit and the autobiography written in Polish custody is not merely one of length or context. It is a difference in register, in the degree to which Höss was, in each document, presenting himself as a subject rather than simply as an operational source. The affidavit is compressed and numerical. It establishes scale, assigns responsibility, and exits. The autobiography, produced over weeks rather than hours, under conditions of relative physical stability, if not freedom, carries a different posture entirely. In it, Höss moves through his own life with something that resembles, on the surface, self-examination. He reflects on his childhood, his military service, his marriage, his years building the camp from a converted barracks into the largest killing installation in history. The reflection is extensive. What it consistently fails to achieve, when read against the expectation that self-examination implies some encounter with moral weight, is the thing it most resembles structurally. This is the distinction the record requires holding carefully. In the autobiography, Höss does begin to describe his own psychological condition during the years of peak killing operations at Auschwitz. He writes about exhaustion. He writes about isolation, a sense that the demands placed on him were not understood or acknowledged by his superiors in Berlin, that he operated without adequate personnel, without consistent supply chains, under pressures that his administrative peers in other postings could not have appreciated. He describes, in one passage, something approaching emotional strain. The language he reaches for, when he attempts to characterize his interior experience of those years, is the language of a manager overwhelmed by the complexity of a large-scale logistical undertaking. It is not the language of a man confronting what the logistical undertaking was. This is significant not because it reveals hypocrisy in the conventional sense, but because it reveals the structure through which Höss organized his own experience into narrative. The categories available to him, the categories that felt natural, that arrived without effort, were administrative categories: burden, capacity, demand, recognition. When he reached for a vocabulary adequate to what he had overseen, the vocabulary that presented itself was the vocabulary of institutional management. That the undertaking being managed was the systematic murder of more than 1 million people does not appear, in the texture of the autobiography, to have generated a competing set of categories that pushed against the administrative ones. The explicit admissions the autobiography contains are, by any measure, extensive. Höss states clearly that he understood the purpose of the Auschwitz-Birkenau complex and his role within it. He acknowledges that the decision to expand from shooting operations to gassing with Zyklon B was one in which he participated, having been summoned to Berlin in the summer of 1941. The precise date remains a matter of some historical discussion, and informed by Himmler that Auschwitz was to become the primary site for the implementation of what the SS described in its own internal language as the final solution of the Jewish question. He does not deny this. He does not qualify his role or attempt to distribute responsibility across a chain of command in a way that removes him from the center of decisions. On the scale of explicit admission among perpetrator testimony, what Höss produced is unusually direct. What he admitted about the victims is a different matter entirely. Across the full length of the autobiography, a document that runs to several hundred handwritten pages in its original form, the people who arrived at Auschwitz and were killed there appear in fewer than a handful of passages as anything other than categorical designations: transport groups, arrival figures, selected percentages. In one passage that historians have noted as among the very few in which Höss appears to acknowledge individual human presence, he describes an encounter with a group of women and children moving toward the gas chambers and records something that might be read as discomfort, a moment of registered awareness. But even in that passage, the discomfort is framed instrumentally. It is presented as a professional difficulty, a test of the composure required to execute the assignment, rather than as the recognition of persons whose lives were ending. The distinction between those two framings is not subtle. It is the difference between a man troubled by what he was doing and a man troubled by the difficulty of doing it correctly. When the testimony record is read across all of its layers, the affidavit, the autobiography, the trial testimony delivered before the Supreme National Tribunal of Poland in March of 1947, and the final written statement produced in the days before his execution, a pattern emerges that is consistent enough to constitute a finding rather than an impression. In none of these documents does Höss describe having experienced moral conflict at the time the events were occurring. In none of them does he record a moment of internal resistance, a period of doubt, a recognition during the years of killing that what was being done was incompatible with a moral order he held. He does, in the final statement and in certain passages of the autobiography, use language that approaches remorse. But the remorse, when it appears, is framed in terms of consequences rather than of meaning. He acknowledges that the scale of what happened at Auschwitz was immense. He does not, in any document in the record, demonstrate that he understood what that scale meant in terms of the individual lives it comprised. The final statement, delivered in writing shortly before his execution by hanging in April of 1947, carried out at the site of the camp he had commanded, is in this respect the compressed endpoint of the entire arc. It is a brief document. In it, Höss expresses what is grammatically recognizable as acknowledgement of harm and something structured like contrition. Historians who have analyzed it closely, including those working with the original Polish-language court record, have noted that the statement reads less like a moral reckoning than like a formal closure of an administrative proceeding, an acknowledgement that the record is complete, that the conclusions are accepted, that the process has reached its terminus. Whether that reading fully captures Höss's interior state in those final days is a question the historical record cannot answer. What the record can show is that the language he chose, even at the moment of closest proximity to his own death, remained language organized around acknowledgement of outcome rather than comprehension of what the outcome meant to those who suffered it. The historian's dilemma that these documents produce is not a dilemma about their factual reliability. It is a dilemma about their completeness as human testimony. Höss gave the historical record an extraordinarily detailed account of how the system functioned. He gave it almost nothing that would allow a reader to understand how a person inhabits such a system, administers it across years, and reaches the end of his life with a vocabulary of self-description that remains organized around institutional categories rather than moral ones. That gap between what the documents contain and what they cannot provide is not incidental to their value as historical sources. It is, in a precise sense, what makes them most difficult to read and most important to understand correctly. Rudolf Höss's autobiography and the testimonial records surrounding it now occupy a specific and somewhat uncomfortable position in the historiography of the Holocaust. They are indispensable. Scholars working on the operational history of Auschwitz, on the administrative decisions that shaped the camp's expansion, on the chronology of the killing operations, on the internal logistics of a facility that processed human beings at a scale no comparable institution had approached, return to these documents repeatedly, because no other source provides the same combination of detail, specificity, and insider positioning. Nicholas Wachsmann's comprehensive history of the Nazi concentration camp system, published in 2015 and drawing on decades of archival research, relies on the Höss record at multiple points precisely because the alternatives are thinner, more partial, or mediated through layers of bureaucratic abstraction that the autobiography, whatever its limitations, cuts through. Deborah Dwork and Robert Jan van Pelt, in their account of Auschwitz as both a physical and historical construction, similarly treat the Höss documents as primary evidence while insisting, with a precision that reflects the scholarly consensus, that the conditions of their production must be held in view at all times. That insistence is the appropriate starting point for any serious engagement with what the documents can and cannot establish. The coercion caveat, as historians have framed it, operates at two distinct levels that are worth separating carefully. The first concerns the earliest statements, the affidavit produced at Nuremberg in the days immediately following Höss's capture, when British military police had subjected him to physical mistreatment during interrogation. Scholars who have examined the circumstances of that initial custody period have noted that the conditions under which the first statements were taken introduce a degree of uncertainty about their precision that does not apply equally to everything that followed. The figures Höss offered in that initial affidavit, including the estimate of 2.5 million killed at Auschwitz, a number that historians have since revised substantially downward on the basis of transport records and other documentary evidence, may reflect, at least in part, the pressure of that context rather than careful recollection. This does not mean the affidavit is without value. It means it is a document produced under specific conditions, and those conditions are part of what the document is. The autobiography is different in degree, if not entirely in kind. Written over weeks in Polish custody, under circumstances that were constrained but not characterized by the acute physical pressure of the initial capture, it represents a more deliberate act of self-presentation. Höss had time to organize his account. He had time to decide what to include and what to omit, what to frame as mitigating circumstance, and what to offer as plain acknowledgement. Historians have generally treated the autobiography as more reliable than the affidavit in its specifics, while maintaining the caveat that a man writing under sentence of death, at the request of prosecutors who had already determined his guilt, is not writing in conditions that produce unconstrained reflection. The document is deliberate. Deliberate is not the same as free. This matters for how the gap at the center of the Höss record is ultimately understood. The gap between the operational completeness of what he described and the near total absence of interior account could, in principle, be attributed partly to the conditions of production. A man writing to satisfy his captors, aware that moral self-examination was not what the interrogation framework was designed to elicit, might suppress or simply not be prompted toward the interior dimension of his experience. That reading is available, but it does not, when examined against the full texture of the documents, fully account for what the record contains. The absence of moral register is not selective in the way strategic suppression would be. It is consistent across every layer of the testimony, including the passages where Höss volunteers information beyond what was asked, including the sections of the autobiography where he writes about his family and his emotional life in terms that suggest a capacity for self-description. The absence is not a hole in an otherwise present interiority. It is a feature of the interiority itself, as the documents reveal it. This is where the system argument becomes necessary, and it is the argument that the Höss record ultimately makes most forcefully, not about the man, but about the institutional structure that formed him and that he, in turn, administered. The concentration camp system, as Theodor Eicke designed it at Dachau, and as Höss absorbed it during his years of apprenticeship there, was organized around a specific relationship between language and action. The administrative vocabulary of the system, selections, special treatment, capacity, processing, was not accidental bureaucratic euphemism. It was a load-bearing structure. It carried the weight of decisions that, described in morally precise language, would have imposed a cognitive burden on those executing them that the system could not sustain at the required scale and pace. Administrative language was not a veil over what was happening. It was the medium through which what was happening could be done continuously by ordinary people without the friction that moral recognition would have introduced at every step. Höss was not unique in this respect. He was not the only man in the SS apparatus who organized mass killing in administrative categories, but he is the only senior figure in that apparatus who produced a self-account of sufficient length and detail to allow the structure of that organization to be read in the document itself. The autobiography is, in this sense, evidence of something larger than its author. It is a record of what the institutional framework made available as a mode of perception, and, correspondingly, what it did not make available, what it foreclosed, what it made difficult or simply absent as a category of experience. There is one further element of the record that the historical literature has not uniformly emphasized, but that bears noting as a condition of how the documents should be received. Höss did not choose to write. He was asked to write. He produced the autobiography not as a voluntary act of testimony, but in response to an institutional request from the prosecutors who held authority over his remaining time. This does not make the autobiography less valuable as a historical source, but it means that what exists is not a memoir in the reflective sense, not a document produced by a man who chose, of his own volition, to set the record straight or to achieve some personal accounting before his death. It is a document produced because a legal process required one. The distinction between those two kinds of writing is not merely procedural. It is a fact about what the document can be expected to contain and what it was never designed to produce. What Rudolf Höss left behind was not a confession in the sense the word typically implies, a reckoning, a confrontation, an encounter between a person and the full weight of what they have done. It was a document. It was detailed, precise in its operational specifics, unusually complete as a record of how the machinery of annihilation was constructed and run. And it was, in the register that matters most for understanding what it means for a human being to have administered such a system, almost entirely silent. That silence is not incidental to the document's historical significance. It is, finally, the most significant thing the document contains, the place where the record ends and the question the record cannot answer begins.